Hello Internet, and welcome to a new sound design workout with the virus, the series where I teach you how to become a sound design wizard using one of my favorite synthesizers of all time, the virus. In this tutorial, I'll teach you how to create two patches that will give a deep psychedelic dimension to your tracks, and they're easy to make. We'll be using OsTirus, the free emulator, but of course the same principles applies to the hardware. Now, before we dive into this tutorial, if you'd like to support the channel, consider hitting that super thanks button that I've just activated on all of my videos, or you can leave a comment, like, and subscribe. Things like that helps the channel a lot. Of course, you can become a Patreon, and if you want psychedelic sounds for your tracks like the one we're making today, consider buying one of my preset packs on my Gumroad or my new website, link down in the description. Now that said, let's dive into this tutorial. So here we have OsTirus. It's an initialized patch, nothing too special. And the basic idea of the first patch actually comes from the famous Sundial lead. So essentially, let's take the first oscillator, let's set it to grain complex like so, and the wavetable, let's set it to Sundial 3. So now we have this. But if we move the F spread or the Foreman spread, we'll get this. Check this out. So that's the basic building block of our sound. But as with everything on my channel, I like to do things with a twist. And the twist in the sound is that I want to mix the grain complex sound, like the Sundial lead sound, with the squelch. So how we're going to do so? First of all, let's take the form and shift like maybe 12 values down, right? Something that sounds like this. Perfect. Now to create the squelch part of the sound, let's go to the LFOs in here. See, LFO number 1 is already pre-routed to the pitch of the oscillators. So let's take oscillator number 1, set it all the way up. And for the modulation, I want something simple, something cyclic. So let's keep it on triangle. On the clock, let's set it something slow, maybe 2-1-1, right? Now we have this. See, we're starting getting something really interesting in here. But this is a repeating modulation, right? Like every couple of bars going to repeat its cycle, and I want to add a twist to it, right? Like everything on my channel. So for that, we're going to take the second LFO in here. We'll set it to sample and hold, and we will ask it to modulate the pitch of the first oscillator, but just a tiny bit, like not a lot, something like that. We can, of course, set it to the right or to the left as you like. I'll keep it to the left, basically negative modulation, but it doesn't really matter because the LFO is bipolar, right? I'll keep the clock to 1 and 8, and I'll set the trigger phase to 1. Basically, every time it receives a new note, it's going to restart its cycle. So now we have this. Now things are starting to get super psychedelic, right? Now, I want to filter things down, and for that, let's go to the filters in here, only filter number 1, and because it's a squelch sound, I'm going to set the filter to bandpass, right? Serial 6, like so, close it, give it some resonance. Now we have this. Perfect. Now we will modulate the filter using, you've guessed it, the second LFO, because it's already pre-routed to it, so it's modulated something like this maybe. Perfect, we're getting that squelchy feeling to the sound. But because the sample and hold is a random stepped modulation, I want to smooth things out by using the first LFO to modulate the filter cutoff. And by the way, this is one of the oldest tricks in the book. If you don't have a sample and glide LFO and you want to get that smoothed random modulation, you will mix a sample and hold LFO with a triangle LFO or a sine LFO, as you like. I prefer triangle. I found it a bit more musical, if that makes sense. But yeah, basically, let's take the first LFO in here, and it's going to modulate the first filter cutoff, just like so. We set it in the opposite direction. And in this case, it's the opposite direction of the pitch modulation. So every time the LFO is going to pitch the oscillator in the higher frequencies, it's going to close the filter and vice versa. Perfect. Now the sound is a bit too squelchy, and I want to emphasize that grain oscillator feeling, or that Sundial famous lead, So what I'm going to do in this case, let's go to the matrix in here, and I'll take the second LFO unipolar, you can do it bipolar as you like, and I'm going to modulate the form and shift of the oscillator. And this will emphasize this grain oscillator or the Sundial lead feeling to it. Just give it this deep psychedelic dimension I'm talking about. Check this out. Oscillator 1, F shift. Let's give it some modulation like so. And now we have this. Now, all we need to do is get back to the filter, close it a little bit. Let's go to the LFO in here. Let's inverse the modulation, because now what's going on is that the modulation on the Foreman shift is pushing the oscillator way too much in the higher frequencies. And I want the filter to cut those frequencies out, right? So that's why I'm going to inverse the modulation, and now we should have something way more interesting. Check this out. Perfect. Maybe try something like this. It's actually giving us better results like so. So let's keep it this way. Let's go back to the filter, maybe just give it a tiny bit more resonance, keep the cutoff in here. Perfect. And now to play the sound, what I'm going to do is use a random arpeggiator. I'm using my clone of Rhythmizer or Autoplay by Author of Wisdom. Now we have this. Perfect. Let's give it a little bit more volume. And now let's add a ping pong delay. For that, let's set the clock in here to 3 on 8, type ping pong 2 to 1, give it some feedback, give it some send. Now we have this. Super trippy. And now with the kick and bass, we'll get this. Super trippy. And by the way, this patch is inspired by one of the presets from my Psytrance Volume 1 preset pack for the virus called Sample and Hold Melting BL. Now, let's move on to the second patch. Now, for the second patch, we're going to use one of the most underrated / unused module of not only the virus, but many other synthesizers, and that is the ring modulator. And honestly, I insist on all of my students to use it because you can get a lot of psychedelic juices out of it. I mean, check this out. Let's start by a simple sine wave on both oscillators, right? So let's set the wave in here to sine wave, just like so. So now we have this. Nothing too special. I already have my clone of Rhythmizer going on, or any random arpeggiator will do the job. Actually, any arpeggiator will do the job. So we have this. Right? It's a bit too clicky. So punch parameter, let's set it to 0. And the phase, let's set it to 1. So now we have this. Way smoother result. And by the way, I've talked about smoothing things out using the punch parameter and the phase position of the oscillators on the virus, of course, in my virus tips and tricks tutorial. So you can check that out right in here. Now, let's get back to the sound. Let's take the oscillators 1 octave higher. So now we have this basically. And let's take their volume down and the ring modulator all the way up. So now we have this. All right, for now, nothing too special, but check what we will get when we start modulating the pitch of the oscillators. So for that, let's go to the LFO, right? The first LFO, let's set it to sample and hold. Let's set the clock to 1 and 8, trick phase to 1. So every time it receives a new note, it's going to restart its cycle. And we will ask it to modulate the pitch of the second oscillator. So now we have this. Okay, now we're starting to get something really interesting, but it's not that psychedelic. Now, to get that psychedelic dimension out of it, we're going to modulate the pitch of the first oscillator, but not by using the first LFO, which is sample and hold. We will use a triangle LFO. For that, I'll use the second LFO in here. Let's set it to pitch of the first oscillator. Let's set it all the way up, like so. And for the clocking, I'm going to set it to off, and I'll leave the rate to free. Let's leave it something in here. All right, maybe a faster rate like so. Okay, now things are getting really psychedelic. Let's go to the filters in here and let's just filter out the nasty lower frequencies. I mean, check this out. Let's add an equalizer first. We have a lot of low-end energy in here. I'm going to take it out with the first filter in here. I'm going to use it like a really simple equalizer, right? Let's set the routing to serial 6. Serial 6 is a 24 dB per octave filter, and serial 4 is a 12 dB per octave filter. I've already explained that in my virus tips and tricks tutorial, so I'll leave a link for that down in the description. Now we have this. Perfect. Now what we can do is go to the effects in here, filter bank. Let's set it to a comb filter, right? Let's set it to the root note of our track, and that is E. Set it somewhere in here. Give it some resonance. That's pretty interesting. But you know what? I'll set the frequency in here to E1, like so. right? I'll use the third LFO that I've set to sample and glide and a clock of 1 and 2 to modulate the pitch of the comp filter, right? For that, let's go to the matrix in here. Let's take third LFO bipolar and let's ask it to modulate the filter bank frequency. Just a tiny bit like so. So now we have this. We're getting that psychedelic dimension I'm talking about. And now let's give the sound some movement by using the third LFO to modulate the panning of the patch. So set it to panorama like so, give it some modulation. Now we have this. See how it's moving in the stereo field now? And to finish it, we'll go to the FXs, the second one. We'll add a delay, a simple 1 1/8 delay with some feedback. Now we have this. And now with the kick and bass, we'll get this. Check this out. Super psychedelic. And this patch is also inspired by one of the presets from my Psytrance Volume 1 preset pack for the virus. It's called Wandering. And yeah, with this is the end of this tutorial. I really hope you've liked it. I really hope you've learned something new. See you in the next one.